Hey everyone, this is Jody from the Narrate team. For the second part of Narrate series, Hello, My Name is Anxiety, Adam starts a conversation on toxic thoughts versus healthy thoughts, and asks the question, what if some portion of your anxiety stems from a larger struggle with toxic thinking?
So have you noticed that life has a way of insisting that we form for ourselves certain categories and then default to those? I want to get us thinking about a particular category that I ultimately want to suggest that we exchange for a new one, but first just kind of walk with me down this path, right? Because there's a practical side to this. The guy named Charles Duhigg has even written a book on the power of habit, and this idea is that you can only sustain so many conscious decisions in a given day, and so categories and defaulting to categories is a certain way that we just persist as humans because we couldn't handle having to make all those decisions. I'm sure there's countless TED Talks on this. But this is, think of a few, and then there's this before we jump further into that. The good news about a habit, about a category or a habit, which is really a categorical habit, I suppose. The good news is you don't have to consciously think about your decision, which of course means that the bad news is you don't consciously think about your decision. And there's some positive examples, like when you all leave here and you get on the street and you drive away, it's a great thing that we've all pre-decided to agree that at a red light, we will all do one thing, and at a green light, we'll all do another thing, right? You with me in this patronizing illustration? Or sports. Sports, they happen because we've all pre-decided to agree upon certain categories, right? And if you don't like sports, then you won't like Narrate. I can give you a recommendation of good churches because I have too many sports references from my artistic friends like Lenny. But nonetheless, let's just take the game of baseball, which is America's sport, not lacrosse. It's baseball, for crying out loud. But the category of ball and strike, it's what makes the game work. Never mind that the umpires in Butte have them completely backwards, like completely swapped the categories. Brands, it's a categorical thing. If you just pause and give it some consideration, that what you see is that what a brand is doing, and the reason why even small businesses are spending thousands of dollars and large corporations millions of dollars, think of something like a Super Bowl ad, the reason they're doing that is because if they can get you to default to trusting their brand, then they can get you to make purchases and make decisions without really having to scrutinize those decisions. So let's just take the Apple. Right? Like the thought I need my phone on my wrist never crossed your mind. And then all of a sudden we put their brand on it and you just trust that it's a product that you ought to have and would make your life better. Or even stores, right? Like the reason why you love restaurants and loathe others, or the reason why we could have this whole probably internal debate of Target versus Walmart, they're categorical things. Right? You buy something from a store because you go, I trust that I will like that product. There's some kind of happy medium between it'll disintegrate in the washing machine versus it has stylistic components to it, right? Like there's this categorical things. But there's also negative aspects to this. Like let's just consider race. Race, while a beautiful God-given thing, when we get our categories wrong, we default to these decisions, and what makes them so hard to break? Like, why do we go, like, how did anybody think that slavery was okay? Well, I guess I would submit to you that when we default to a category, that's the benefit of a categorical decision, is we don't think about it anymore, we just do it. And so as you think of all the different racial things that have happened and all the different negative aspects of that, let's just talk Japanese internment during World War II in the United States. Or, of course, the low-hanging fruit of Nazi Germany, what's happening with ISIS. I mean, we could go on and on and on. Are those a group of people who are daily making a decision to dislike or to abuse certain people? Or are they people who made that decision once and then just default into it unbeknownst to themselves? Or gender? Of course, this one's a tinderbox of sorts. But what are the gender problems that we continue to deal with? They're categorical distinctions. And of course, in one sense, gender is a very obvious one. But in another sense, when we get them wrong, and just to be clear, men get them wrong, women get them wrong, things go very, very south. Well, I say all that because I just want to get you thinking. I guess really what I want to do this morning is suggest to you that there is a way that we categorize our thoughts, that we default to thinking like either that's the right way or it's the wrong way. And I guess I want to suggest this morning that there's a better categorical distinction for our thoughts. The broken one that I want to suggest, and I think if you were with us last week, I even implied it, is this idea of positive versus negative thinking. And the funny thing about it, listen, we started this series last week about anxiety, and what I love about this conversation is for some of you, this captures like the very core of your angst and your pain. It captures the very essence of what you're trying to help other people that you're serving with. And for others of you, it captures the essence of your cynicism and lack of empathy and lack of understanding. Because you're like, I don't understand it. You just do it. And you would never admit it, and I would never ask you to, but you have almost no compassion for this whole kind of collective thing because you're just like, you just do it. Positive versus negative thinking, I think, if we're to be honest, has a similar dynamic. And those of you who loathe it, you would say things like, no, it's not, I'm a realist, right? And then you would call your spouse some kind of naive, like, optimist. Now, I had this reminder this week. I was at a 9U baseball game, which is my life right now, and I love it. And it was city tournament time, and my 9-year-old was on a team. It was kind of like the Bad News Bears, but you don't necessarily know who that is either. But, I mean, they worked really hard. They had great coaches, but they were the 8th seed in a 9-team league as they headed into the city tournament. And so as the first game started, after 2 innings, they were up 6-0 on Coke, the mighty powerhouse. And so all the fans, and I was sitting in this group of people, or standing with, because who sits at a baseball game? That too is un-American. Nonetheless, like, when did lawn chairs get introduced to the game of baseball? That's what I want to know. There's this whole etiquette now, like, you can't stand up against the fence because there's all these people in lawn chairs that you're going to stand in front of. They're like, what is this? Anyway, that's for soccer. Take your lawn chairs to soccer. Just kidding. Anyway, so we're standing, and there were several families cheering for several different players for this one team. And they got out to this lead, and we were all excited. And then, of course, the game of sport, or the game of baseball in particular, as it goes, like, so it was 6-0, and then it was like 7-2. By the 5th inning, it was 8-5, and there wasn't a person in the world who would have bet that our team, who jumped out to this lead and now had an 8-5 lead, was going to win the game. It just had that sense of like, Mr. Momentum has changed teams. And we're all standing there watching a bunch of 9-year-olds, hoping that maybe the miraculous would happen, like Rudy, or something along those lines. And one of I think she was a grandma, she stated the obvious. That's all she did. She arrived at it innocently. She just said something like, I don't know about this. And one of the moms, who is this person, I think it was grandma, mom, I'm not sure the whole relational dynamic. I should, but I'm antisocial and introverted, so I didn't meet them the entire season, though they hang out here. Nonetheless, the mom said, hey, get that negative thinking out of here. And it was this classic Narrate cynicism. I loved it. We've talked about it. She said, it's nothing but positive thoughts going on in my head. And then she added, and this was like prophetic, Gospel of Isaiah kind of genius. She said, it's all rainbows and unicorns in my head. and I thought, like, touche, right? Because I just spent this whole week talking about our thoughts and positive versus negative, and I thought, you know what? She's right. Like, those of you who are cynical towards this whole idea of positivity, and you have a right to be, that's the problem, isn't it? It's predicated in naivete, it's predicated in dishonesty, it's predicated in being delusional. It seems to presume that you just stick your head in the ground and pretend like the world's not coming to an end, when in fact it is. Which is why this morning, I guess I want to suggest a new category that I think. Several years ago, we did a series from Dr. Cloud's Boundaries book, and even in that series, we said, like, what would happen if we introduced this kind of language into our relationships and our marriage? At the time, it was boundaries. I want to suggest this morning, what would happen if we categorized thinking into this new set of categories? Now, for that new set of categories, I'm indebted to a woman named Dr. Carolyn Leaf. Some of you may be familiar with her, others are not. She hails from South Africa. Not the same continent as Kate, I've learned. Just kidding. Such an overused joke. But she's from South Africa. She now lives in Texas. The first time I heard her was several years ago. I was at a conference called Q in Nashville, which is a great place to go to a conference, by the way. And to be honest with you, the first time I heard her, I mean, I'm judgmental like you are. The difference between us is I have a microphone right now. I didn't like her. And it wasn't that her ideas weren't interesting to me. There were 2 things that really caused me to go like, nah, not reading it, not listening to it. One was, to be honest, and she's a neurologist. Did I already say that? So she's steeped in science. She's a PhD in neurology. She's kind of in that whole nerdy brand of science that is so prevalent right now and so helpful on so many levels. She's pretty black and white in her thinking. Pretty prescriptive, and I guess if you're a scientist, like, you don't get to be like me and go like, I don't know, what if? Like, you kind of have to have definitive thoughts, so fair enough. Very black and white, to the extent that if if you read her stuff, and we brought 50 of her book and blew through them this morning, so we'll bring more next week. Sorry about that. Like, you're ready, like we're the forgotten 11:30, and now you don't even have books for us. No, but in July, we're going to have popsicles. We were talking about that at Creative Team this week. So you just hold on. We're not forgetting about you. She's pretty black and white. She goes so far as to say things like, really she implies that there's no place for pharmaceuticals, that all problems can be solved outside of that. And when, it's kind of, I don't know that I like that. The other thing for me personally was that she's from Texas, from the Bible Belt. And so she's not from there, but that's where she lives now. Pretty Christianese. That would be my assessment. Like, her language is a little too peppered with Christianese, and the people we're trying to serve and the life we're trying to live here, it was just too much for me. So I put her on the back shelf. And then, sometimes ideas just kind of stick with you, and you just kind of like, I should have listened in geometry because now I own a house and I don't know how to figure this out. Like, it just kind of hung out in the back of my head. And as I was preparing for Ecuador, desperate for resources, I remembered her stuff and grabbed her book. And I will say this, though maybe, it is the single most helpful thing I've accessed in relationship to my anxiety. For the longest time, people have went like, hey, what do I read? And I went like, I've got 10 books that are marginally helpful. It's the one that I recommend now, despite some of the stuff that I disconnect from. And here's the beginning of why. What she suggests is that the way that we should categorize thought isn't positive versus negative, because there's some fogginess to that language, but instead healthy versus toxic. And you can see part of what she's challenged you to distinguish isn't true versus untrue, but helpful versus unhelpful. Like a decision to focus on what you can control, what's going to take you in the direction you do want to go, versus what you can't control and is going to take you in the wrong direction. And her whole, the whole thesis of her work, and in another sense, this whole band of science, and she's not alone. There's a whole bunch of stuff happening on Gregory Burns, to name another. Neurology is exploding. You should get a degree in neurology. Anyway, there's this whole band, and it's all predicated upon this conversation, and she opens her work with it. She would say, the question we have to start with is, does the brain control the mind, and thus the emotions and the experience of life? Meaning, does the physical, material, objective brain control the thoughts, and everything flows downhill from there? Or do the thoughts control the brain, and in turn, the emotions and the experience of life? And you go, well, why does that matter? Well, think of it this way. If we determine that the problem is the physical mechanism, the brain, then how do you in turn treat that problem? Via the physical, which would lead many to suggest, thus the rise of pharmaceuticals, because we've concluded that the primary problem is the physical brain, and thus, if we can fix that, we can fix the emotional aspect. But if you conclude that the mind is the primary driver, then how do we fix that? Well, first step is we take personal responsibility for the fact that our own thinking patterns have contributed to our experience of an emotional life. Now, like many of you, I'm going like, could we have both? Like, I want a little bit of both. And that to me, if nothing else, seems diplomatic. And if you weren't with us last week, you guys, I have zero interest in somehow, this is not about for or against pharmaceuticals. Here's the way I would frame this for you. If your thinking versus your physical brain, if it's only 10% of the problem, then does that make it worth your while to address that part of the problem? Like, if your thoughts only contribute to 10% of your experience of anxiety, how much change can you bring about by going that direction? By exhausting that aspect. Maybe we could put it this way. If your business grew by 10%, like, would that change the dynamics of your business? If your personal budget was 10%, like if your personal income went up 10% next year, would you feel that? Like if you lost 10% of your body weight, would that be a good thing? So here, I'm going to ask you, because I admit, and I've said all that to say, if you read her stuff, and I'm going to beg you to read it, it's a little black and white, but if it's only a part of the problem, it becomes a pretty big potential game changer. Now, the band of science that she's talking about here, and I'm about to give you the most overly simplistic, offensive if you're in this in the stream kind of explanation of this, but what we're talking about here is neuroplasticity. And what neuroplasticity, and this is not a Christian thing, this is a science thing, this is so great to be a Christ follower and hold science in one hand and the Bible in the other because they are not at odds with one another thing. What neuroplasticity is saying is, contrary to what was the common conclusion not very long ago, the brain is constantly changing. It is not this fixed, concrete, static thing that is what it is, what it is. What neuroplasticity is saying is, no. When you think, you activate chemicals in your body and especially your brain, and those chemicals form proteins, and those proteins form microscopic structures within your brain. And so therefore, the old adage of as you thinketh you are has some truth to it, though we've got to be careful to include the emotional connectedness piece. Because what neuroplasticity is saying is your thoughts actually become the physical structure of your brain. And if we could put it under a microscope, or if we could follow it through all those kind of electrode things they do, what we would see is your thinking patterns, they show up in your physical patterns. Now, who cares? Well, here's why, right? Because we learn things on a need-to-know basis. Here's for me why I began to care about this. Several years ago, a friend not from here, a friend of a friend not from here, wrote a check for almost $5,000 to send me to a week-long psychotherapy conference in California. Now, they didn't call it a psychotherapy conference. The bait and switch was much more tactful than that, though I'm grateful for having gone. Because who's like, oh yeah, I want to go to the psychotherapy conference. Like, who signs up for that? No, it was a leadership conference. That's what it was. And it had about 1/3 didactic classroom with a couple of the best thinkers in the whole world on these matters, Drs. Henry Cloud and John Townsend. And then it had about 2/3 in the small group of 8 therapy session with some of the best psychotherapists from Southern California. I learned that when I got there, they call Wednesday Wailing Wednesday. Nobody signs up for this stuff, right? Like, it's not on the brochure. On Wednesday morning, let me first say this. When I got on the plane, my hope was that finally, having received some of the best treatment in the world, I was going to discover the silver bullet, Whether that was a pill or a device, I couldn't have cared less. I was just excited to come home anxiety-free. Having sat in the sessions, both classroom and personal, both didactic and psychotherapy, by Wednesday morning, I sat down in the classroom session at 8:30 in the morning after 2 12-hour days, and to be honest with you, I was pretty bummed. Because what I had concluded from my psychotherapy sessions up until that point was that the best I could do was choose to battle my anxiety for the rest of my life. That what I could do is own that because of my own family of origin, because of my own personal decisions, because of my own background, because of my own DNA, because of my own, I can't explain why, but it just is kind of stuff, that anxiety was a real part of my life and would be, and what I could do for the rest of my life is choose on a moment-by-moment basis to say no. In fact, it was so sad to me that I said this very insensitive thing to a woman that was in my group. She was processing rape. And I remember saying to her, listen, don't get me wrong, that's horrific. But I envy that you can locate your thing to a spot in time. And I can't even do that. I just have to accept this is who I am. You guys, if neuroplasticity is a science that can be trusted, if Dr. Leaf is onto anything, and in a minute I'm going to demonstrate if the scriptures can be trusted, it's not true. And it's why today, though it sounds like something you'd hear on some kind of self-help seminar, I don't think it's true anymore. I no longer live under the guise that my emotional reality of anxiety will be at 50 what it is today at 37. And I have confirmed I'm 37, not 38, and that's a reference to last week. I don't think it's the case. And it's because of this neuroplasticity dynamic. Listen to the way Paul says this in Philippians verse 4. So neuroplasticity is saying one thing. Listen to the way Paul's saying it. Hold on, before I do that, let me make one more reference. Here's another way that I've kind of understood this personally, and I'm sure some of you have had this experience. When I was 19 years old, I made a decision to follow Jesus that in my own family of origin had some radical nature to it. At the time, I didn't know what I was doing. But at the time, I threw myself into a completely different type of people. I started reading the scriptures on a daily basis. I started reading books. I developed mentor friendships. I started volunteering at a local church. I started attending a local church. All kinds of things happened. You know what happens today when I get myself back in Laurel or around certain people who were a part of my life prior to them? I feel like a completely different person. And it's not a pretentious thing, but sometimes I'll be in these environments and like people that I grew up with, whom I still love dearly, will start talking about money. And I'll go like, why in the world would you think that? And I like, it's not like I'm making a conscious decision to go like, what would Jesus do? What would Jesus do? No, but like my default thinking on so many of these topics is so radically different. Does that make sense? Do you have that experience? And I go, why? Well, I suppose a cynic would say because I'm pulling myself up by my bootstraps and in a moment-by-moment decision, making different decisions about what I believe, it's not what I would say. What I would say, and what's neuroplasticity has helped me to understand, is I'm a completely different dude now. Like my brain structure thinks about things like money and the language that I use and the value. They're just completely different. It's like the scientific explanation for what the scriptures describe as terms of transformation. To the extent that the other day I was crossing the street in the office. I think I was walking to lunch, and I looked up in the sky, and it was wide open, beautiful sky, and there was what I'm assuming was a 747, and like it doesn't matter if it's accurate. I just assumed that it was, but it sure looked like a big plane. And this is the way my brain works. I saw the 747, and because 747s don't fly from like Billings to Helena, I thought that thing's headed from like Minneapolis to Tokyo. And you know what thought I had? Anxiety. Like I instantly was like, I could never go to Tokyo. This is the way my neurotic brain works. And if you could have hooked me up to some kind of sensors, I'm guessing my heart rate went up. What Dr. Leaf's helped me to do is go like, that's toxic. Catch yourself in that and as I caught myself going like, well, that's stupid. If God wanted me to go to Tokyo, I could do that. And I could have fun doing that. I went to Ecuador and I enjoyed it all. What if, I guess what I'm saying is, what if what she's saying is actually sound science as well as traditional biblical orthodox following Jesus-ness? Listen to the way Paul says it in Philippians 4. Sorry, I'm wound up maybe. Finally, and some of you've heard this verse a billion times, I'm just asking you to consider the idea that God somehow helped people understand the dynamics of neuroplasticity without even knowing the word. Watch this. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Is that mindless, empty self-help? Or is that a guy driven by the Spirit of God who seems to understand and has observed in his own culture, in his own way? No. What you think shapes your reality. Like, is this Paul going like, hey, just be positive, don't be negative? No, the words, and I would challenge you to break them down in your own study, the dynamic is healthy. It's think about what you can control, not what you can't. What's taking you where you want to go, not what's not. There's certain things that you can't control, so why would you choose to fixate on those? Which means that for those of you, and some of you will relate to this, and some of you will be like, man, I got to find a healthier church. Like some days I'll drop my kids off at school, and it doesn't happen all the time, but enough that I remember to tell the story, and I'll think like, they'll run away from the Suburban, and I'll think, this could be the last time I ever see them, because this could be the day that a shooter shows up at the school and everything's over and my life is different forever and their poor tragic ending. I'm not joking. What if what Paul is saying is like, no. What you need to do is learn that you have somehow bought into a toxic thought pattern. And what you need to do is catch that trigger, recognize that trigger, and rewire the trigger. I was watching my 10-year-old pitch the other night. It was in a playoff game, and like I'm in the dugout going bonkers internally. Like it was horrible. 3-0 count with the bases loaded, and I had to leave. Not kidding. And I thought to myself, this is why I quit pitching. I couldn't handle it anymore. Pitching's terrible. We should go back to like hiking and stuff. Baseball's terrible. And it wasn't until I got home that I went, no, that's that same toxic pattern that became ingrained. There's a whole different set of options. Like going, this is 10-year-old baseball. The outcome's not that big a deal. There's life skills that I'm going to develop that are far greater than the game. All I can do is what I can do and work hard. And guess what? The other guys work hard. There's all kinds of healthy alternatives to quitting or just going crazy inside. Listen to the way Paul says it in 1 Thessalonians 5. And some of you are going like, these are the same verses last week. I know, I only read 3 a year. So here we go. Rejoice always. Pray continually. Give thanks in all circumstances. Well, why ought I to do that? For this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. Wait a minute. I thought God's will was that I vote Republican or Democrat. Like I thought God's will was that I hold certain signs on certain matters on certain street corners. Now this Paul is going, you want to talk about God's will? Let's start with gratitude. Let's start with focusing on the things that you can be grateful for, the things that can move you forward. You know what I see in the process of leading people through memorial services? I think oftentimes people who don't follow Jesus are better at this in those moments than those of us who claim to believe it. They have this way of going, wait a minute. Let's celebrate. You know, when I was getting ready for Ecuador, it was this verse and this whole process that caused me to I can say I experienced the whole trip without but a tiny moment of anxiety. It was when I looked on that dumb map on the plane and we're like, all of a sudden we're flying over Colombia and I'm like, what am I doing in Colombia? I don't want to be in Colombia. Anyway, it's just little. But my strategy and the reason I adverted it was I pre-decided that when I had the anxious thought, and to be clear, it started at 4 a.m. when my alarm clock went off, and I realized that my wife and I were going to walk out of the house, leaving our boys sleeping in the house to be picked up by our friends who loved them and would take care of them while we were gone, and if something bad happened to them, I wouldn't be able to rescue them. And I pre-decided at any trigger of anxiety, I'm just going to start rattling off what I'm grateful for. And it wasn't external, it was just this internal thing. And I'm so grateful that I get to go to Ecuador with my wife. This is so central to her. Like I can look her in the eyes, and because I've experienced this with her, this has been like there's been so much great work that's been done down there. There's so many people that we've served. That there's kids who couldn't walk who are walking now. I'm so grateful that I get to experience God in this different culture. I'm so grateful that my kids won't have the same attachment issues I do because they've experienced me leaving for extended time. And I would just start rattling through it. Guess how many things you have to say before you're just completely off of the anxiety trigger? It's not many. In fact, we're going to close the series in July. There's some science that would say it's about 20 seconds. That really, if you want to like rewire your brain, you're really talking about 30 seconds a day, where you've got to make conscious decisions to go a different direction. Here's my point, you guys. What if he knew what he was talking about? What if, go ahead, next slide. What if some portion of your anxiety struggle stems from a struggle with toxic thinking? Whether this goes back several generations or to a trigger point in your own life, yeah, those are all important conversations. But what if somehow you bear some responsibility because of your thinking habits? See, if you engage Dr. Leaf's book, and I'm sorry, we sold out. We just have no intelligent way of understanding how many we would sell, so we'll bring more back. You can get them on Amazon yourself. The royalties we get are awesome, by the way. I mean, woo, they're incredible. Just kidding. It's an $8 book. Let us know. We'll have a bunch here next week. What she's going to lead you through, she's going to lead you through this. Listen to what Paul says in 2 Corinthians. Because this is like, am I reading from a scientific journal or am I reading from the Bible? For though we live in the world, but we do not wage war as the world does, the weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. Look at verse 5. Some of you are going like, this sounds nothing like a scientific journal. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. You know what neuroplasticity is saying? That as a human being, assuming the brain is working correctly, you have the ability to get outside of self and be self-aware of what you're thinking about. And then Christ will help you begin to understand how what you're thinking about impacts who you are and the way your brain is getting hardwired. What Dr. Leaf will lead you to, if you choose to follow her through, is a 21-day cycle that starts by you going, okay, what's the toxic thought that I want to address? and then pre-deciding what's going to be the healthy response whenever I have that trigger moment. What am I going to do instead? And the science behind it is, as you make healthy decisions, not toxic decisions, you're denying the structure within your brain that's the unhealthy part. You're denying it the necessary nutrients, thus shriveling it, and you're literally building a new physical structure within your brain, which is why I'm pretty confident going like 20 years from now, I firmly believe I will have a completely different experience of anxiety should I do the work. You know, we asked this question this week on SurveyMonkey. What percentage of you know your triggers? This is encouraging. Look at this. 95% of you go, yep, I know the triggers. And then we said, how many of you are able to avert disaster when the trigger strikes? Look at this. Almost 75% of you go like, I don't have very much confidence here. What if that's not you have a physical problem that you can't overcome issue? It's a thinking well and healthy is hard work, and nobody learns it by default. Maybe you have a family of origin that's better at it than most, but it's going to take work. Here's my question. What happens if your posture towards God right now, today, this week, is, Lord, I have a toxic thinking problem. And I just want to confess that it doesn't honor you. It doesn't honor the way you made me. It doesn't complement the life you've called me to live. It's just not. It's sin. And what happens within your family unit if you develop familiar common language where you just call out toxic thinking? What happens to your office, to your organization, to the people you do life with, if you just kind of create this collective agreement, like we're just going to shame one another? That'd be ironic. We're just going to shame one another right out of toxic thinking. Like what happens to a family tree when someone stands up and goes, you know what? Toxic thinking seems to be the default. And I have a bigger hill to climb than most, but we are going to change the climate of the way we think. I'd like to pray, and we're going to sing a song and give you a chance to process all this, God. Lord, I'm so grateful to live in the age of science, as we like to call it, though that might be a little arrogant. Lord, thanks that those of us working hard to trust you and the scriptures and the historical Christ, that we can come alongside these women and men who've dedicated their lives to understanding the chemicals and the hormones and the synapses and the brain and all of its intricacies. And that just further helps us understand ourselves, what it means to be human and what it means to follow you. Jesus, there are families in this room who are in deep. And it'll take 20 years to trench their way out. God, we know that your grace is opposed to earning, not to effort. And so we just beg that your grace and that the living Christ would come alongside us, and that you'd also prompt us to do the hard work required to trench our way out. God, I pray that hope would permeate as we understand that it doesn't have to be our reality forever. And Lord, for people here who, quite frankly, need more than a book and a circle of friends to help them process through this, but they need clinical help, would you give them the courage to take that step as well? Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.